The fateful crossroads, Hitler's obsession and the unmaking of the Third Reich. Imagine a moment etched in the annals of history, a decision so monumental that it irrevocably altered the course of the 20th century. June 22, 1941. A date that resonates with the chilling echoes of strategic miscalculation and ideological fervor. This was the day Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, a gamble that would ultimately seal the fate of Nazi Germany. Step back into the war rooms of Berlin, 1941. Picture the scene. Vast maps spread across polished oak tables, meticulously marked with potential invasion routes. At the center of this strategic web stood Adolf Hitler, a dictator consumed by a messianic vision of racial purity and territorial expansion. He stood at a critical juncture, a crossroads, where the future of his 1,000-year Reich hung precariously in the balance. To the west, Great Britain, defiant and unyielding, remained an unconquered island fortress. To the east, the immense Soviet territories stretched out, a land of both immense promise and terrifying uncertainty. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was not merely a strategic calculation, it was a manifestation of a deeply ingrained ideological crusade. The Nazi worldview, steeped in racial supremacy and expansionist ambitions, saw the Slavic lands as more than just a potential conquest. It was a racial and philosophical battleground, a testing ground for the twisted ideals of the Third Reich. Lebensraum, the concept of living space, was not simply a strategic objective. It was a warped vision of racial purification and territorial domination, fueled by a belief in the inherent superiority of the Aryan race. The Soviet Union, with its multicultural society, communist ideology, and millions of people deemed racially inferior in Hitler's distorted worldview, represented everything the Nazi regime both feared and despised. Military historians, in their meticulous analyses of the Second World War, would later identify Operation Barbarossa as one of the most catastrophic strategic decisions in modern warfare. Hitler, blinded by his own hubris and ideological convictions, believed the Soviet Union to be a colossus with feet of clay, a massive but fundamentally weak entity that would crumble under the weight of a swift, decisive strike. Despite intelligence reports warning of the Red Army's substantial strength and the vastness of Soviet territory, Hitler dismissed these concerns, convinced that his military genius would prevail. This fatal miscalculation, born of ideological blindness and strategic arrogance, would have devastating consequences for the German war effort. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa was not a singular event, but rather the culmination of several interconnected factors, each contributing to the strategic miscalculation that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. The stalled British invasion, frustration and impatience. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies above England, had proven far more challenging than anticipated. The Royal Air Force's tenacious defense had thwarted the Luftwaffe's attempts to establish air superiority, rendering a cross-channel invasion increasingly complex and costly. This stalemate on the Western Front fueled Hitler's frustration and impatience, leading him to seek a quicker, more decisive victory in the East. Ideological obsession, the drive for Lebensraum, Nazi racial theory, with its emphasis on Aryan supremacy and the need for living space, played a crucial role in shaping Hitler's strategic thinking. The Slavic territories of the Soviet Union were viewed as a potential colonial frontier, ripe for exploitation and settlement by the master race. The Soviet Union was not simply a military target, it was an ideological enemy that needed to be eradicated to pave the way for the realization of the Nazi vision of a racially pure and territorially expansive empire. The preventive war mentality, a gamble for dominance. Hitler, driven by a belief in his own infallibility and a desire to secure German dominance over Europe, convinced himself that a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union was necessary to prevent a potential two-front war. By neutralizing the Soviet threat quickly, he hoped to consolidate his conquests in Europe and eventually return to the task of breaking British resistance. This preventive war mentality, fueled by paranoia and a thirst for power, led him to gamble everything on a single audacious military operation. What began as a calculated military operation, driven by strategic miscalculation and ideological fervor, quickly transformed into one of the most brutal and devastating campaigns in human history. Millions of soldiers and civilians, on both sides of the conflict, would be consumed by the flames of war, their lives tragically cut short in a human catastrophe that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of World War II. The Eastern Front became a theater of unparalleled brutality, marked by massacres, forced labor, and systematic extermination, leaving an indelible scar on the collective memory of Europe. In a cruel twist of historical irony, Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, instead of consolidating his gains in Western Europe, proved to be the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Operation Barbarossa exposed the fundamental weaknesses of Nazi military strategy: overextension, logistical challenges, ideological blindness, and a profound underestimation of the resilience and determination of the Soviet people. The Soviet Union, contrary to Hitler's expectations, did not crumble under the initial onslaught of the German invasion. Instead, it mobilized its vast resources and manpower, transforming itself into a formidable fighting force that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. The Red Army, fighting not just as a military force but as a nation defending its very existence, mounted a fierce and determined resistance, inflicting heavy casualties on the invading German forces and shattering the myth of Nazi invincibility. Operation Barbarossa was more than just a military campaign. It was a pivotal moment in history where ideology, strategic miscalculation, and human determination converged to shape the course of the 20th century. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union transformed a potentially winnable war into an inevitable defeat, stretching German forces to their breaking point and exposing the Third Reich to a relentless and determined enemy fighting for survival. The vastness of the Soviet territory, the harshness of the Russian winter, and the unwavering resistance of the Soviet people combined to create a perfect storm that would ultimately engulf the Nazi regime. As the first German tanks rolled across the Soviet border on that fateful June morning, few could have fully comprehended the monumental consequences that would unfold. A decision made in the war rooms of Berlin, driven by ideological fanaticism and strategic miscalculation, would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Nazi regime, the reshaping of the global order, and the enduring legacy of a conflict that continues to haunt the collective memory of humanity. The invasion of the Soviet Union stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, ideological extremism, and the catastrophic consequences of strategic miscalculation. It is a lesson that must be heeded by future generations to prevent the recurrence of such a devastating conflict.